All right, everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Paula Messimer, and I'm a product manager at Radius Soft. Our speaker for today is my colleague, Jon Edelen. Jon is an accelerator physicist specializing in thermionic cathode guns and space charge effects in low-energy electron beams. Jon earned his PhD in accelerator physics from the Colorado State University. As a Bardeen Fellow at Fermilab, he worked on RF systems for the PIP2 injector test beam dynamics and RF transient effects in the proposed PIP2 accelerator, and as well as thermionic cathode RF guns at the advanced photon source. At Radius Soft, Jon is actively involved in our machine learning related research and development projects, as well as machine learning consulting work for customers. The title of today's talk is Using ML Autoencoders for Anomaly Detection in Accelerator Controls.
Okay, so hello everybody. Today I'm going to be giving a presentation on anomaly detection in particle accelerators using autoencoders. And yeah. So a quick little overview about why we're interested in anomaly detection in accelerators, and just to provide some context sort of based in accelerator operations. There's kind of three broad categories of time that's spent in accelerator operations. We have accelerator R&D, which is, machine development time or specialized R&D facilities, things like that. This is specifically focused on doing research to improve accelerator performance or new accelerator technologies. There's delivering beam for experimentalists, which is, anything from these small single user end stations like X-ray light sources to large experimental collaborations such as the ones pictured here. This is the G-2 ring at Fermilab. And that's obviously a very important part of accelerator facilities. And then there's downtime. And downtime can be scheduled maintenance, which is sort of regular repairs to the accelerator, or unscheduled maintenance where something breaks and we need to go in and fix it. So the idea is that if we can improve our diagnostic capabilities and better understand how to detect anomalies, we can minimize the amount of unscheduled maintenance time that we have and try to do predictive fault detection or understand better when faults are going to occur, so that we can move unscheduled maintenance into scheduled maintenance and maximize the amount of beam time for experimentalists and for accelerator R&D. There's two sort of primary approaches for machine learning for this sort of application, supervised and unsupervised learning. There's other methods as well, but these are kind of the two primary ones. In supervised learning, you know what the outputs are, you know what the inputs are, and you're just trying to learn some kind of a representation that tells you what your outputs are for a given set of inputs. So in the case of anomaly detection, you have a labeled data set of a bunch of faults, and you can train a neural network to correlate machine settings to fault conditions and just do predictive fault detection that way. Or for more sort of broader example is, convolutional neural nets to classify different kinds of animals. You have a large labeled data set where you understand, and you're just trying to develop a tool to tell you the relationship between input and output data. Unsupervised learning is the case where you don't know what the faults are, or you don't maybe you have a very imbalanced data set where you have a lot of data during normal operations and you don't have much data during faults, or you don't know really what the faults are that you're looking for. This is nice because in accelerator operations, oftentimes there is lots of stable operation and a lot of data logging during sort of normal conditions. So in this case, you can use a machine learning tool to basically learn what good is and then tell you when something fails to be good. And I'll talk mostly about that during today's presentation. And then a sort of a classic example, and this is actually the focus of the Jupyter notebook that we're going to send out, is using an autoencoder to detect credit card fraud. And in that case, you have a lot of normal transactions, and then you have some fraudulent transactions, and you basically train the autoencoder to understand what a normal transaction is, and then detect what an abnormal transaction is based on how well it reconstructs the data. So what is an autoencoder? Autoencoder is a neural network structure, and essentially you have a number of hidden layers where you're reducing the number of nodes down to some minimum dimensionality, which is referred to as the latent space, and then you increase it back using a decoder to reconstruct the output. So here you don't have inputs and outputs, you just have a set of data, and you're trying to essentially learn an identity transformation for the input data. This is useful for two different things. So the first is if you can learn this reconstruction, this identity transformation very accurately, then you essentially have a dimensionality reduction tool. So you can take the autoencoder, train it, and then you can, once it's trained, you can, for a given set of inputs, output the data in the latent space, and now you have a reduced representation or a compressed representation of your input data set. This is kind of an advantage for accelerator operations because there's tons of parameters in the control room, and expert operators have to be able to look at and understand a lot of different parameters. If there's a way to take large subsystems or large submachines and then break it down and say, basically, for this collection of systems, we have an encoded space that is a reduced number of parameters that we can look at to kind of flag anomalies, that would be super helpful. As opposed to saying, for example, I'll talk about this in the Fermilab LINAC a little bit later. And the other thing is to do this reconstruction test. And this is applicable, this is kind of what I was talking about with credit card fraud or other types of things where you have a lot of data on known good operations or known good conditions, and then you train the autoencoder, and then you test it on unknown data. And how well the autoencoder reconstructs the unknown data basically tells you how similar the data sets are, the new data is, to your training data. And in this case, similar might not be, dissimilar data might not be a bad thing, but in some cases, dissimilar means that it is anomalous or it is bad, and you can just have one performance metric, which is sort of the reconstruction error, how well the autoencoder reconstructs the test data. So for the talk today, I'm going to focus on two case studies. One is a latent space analysis using the Fermilab low energy LINAC. And here the idea is to identify, do root cause analysis using the latent space to understand relationships between changes in the beam current in the LINAC and changes in the RF parameters in the low energy LINAC. And then the second study is using a reconstruction test to try to identify faulty magnets in the APS storage ring. And I'll talk about these in detail, starting with the Fermilab low energy LINAC. So just to orient you to the LINAC, Fermilab accelerator complex is shown on the left here. It has LINAC accelerates H- to 400 MeV, it injects into a booster ring. The booster synchrotron accelerates it to 8 GeV and sends the beam off to experimental stations and also to other accelerators to then send to other experimental stations. The LINAC itself is broken down into four primary components. There's the ion source, the RFQ, the drift tube LINAC, and then the coupled cavity LINAC sections. And for this study, I'm focusing primarily on the drift tube LINAC section, which is composed of 5 DTL tanks. Each DTL tank has RF amplitude and phase measurements. There's a beam current measurement at the end of each DTL, and then there's some beam loss monitors associated with each DTL. For this study, I focused on the RF amplitude and phase and the beam current measurements because the beam loss monitors are a little bit more touchy and not quite as easy to correlate to the other measurements. So just focusing on those two diagnostics. We looked at archive data over a 20-week run period starting in the fall of last year and going until the spring of this year. And this is sort of broken down into 3 kind of operational periods. There's this tune-up period where a lot of the machines just turning back on after a shutdown. There's a lot of parameters that are changing. You can see on the lower left here, or on the lower right here during the tune-up region, there's large sections where there's no beam. There's sections where the beam is changing a lot. And then there's a stable operation period. Stable operations is just sort of everything looks normal for a fairly extended period of time. And there's not a whole lot of tuning going on. The tank RF amplitude and phases are relatively consistent, and there's not much changing in the LINAC. And then there's this reduced output section, which is sort of following some changes in what looks like the RF parameters, and then a little bit of tuning, and then the beam output sort of settles out at some other value that's not the same as the stable operations value. And the idea is to try to understand if there's something we can learn about the RF parameters that sort of help us explain why we had this change in the output current of the LINAC. So this is just taking a little bit of a zoom in on the data set that we used for the autoencoder. So on the left, this is the beam current data, and I've just taken off the first 5 weeks. I've zoomed in on the sort of the scale of interest, and we can see clearly that there is a shift in the output current in all 5 tanks, and that it sort of drifts a little bit and then settles out at some new value that's a bit lower than it was during sort of stable operations. And then on the right, we're looking at the RF parameters. We have the amplitude and phase measurements for each of the 5 tanks. And just for the sake of showing relative changes here, I've subtracted the median value from each one of these, so you can show them on the same plot and just get an idea of how these parameters are changing with time. There's some very clear changes in the RF parameters. The jump in tank 3 phase around week 13, a little before week 13, and then there's another jump in tank 1 phase, and then there's some tuning, and the RF parameters settle out to what is sort of visibly a different set of settings, but it's not really clear just from looking at these data and looking at the beam current that there's any kind of causal relationship between these changes. So before we talk about autoencoders, I want to just show sort of some baseline studies. So kind of a naive or sort of first order approach would be to say, well, we can look at the vector sum of the signals for the 5 tanks, and we can track the vector sum and see how that changed and see if the vector sum signals are at all correlated with the beam current signals. And what I mean by vector sum is you just take each of the 5 amplitude and phases, decompose it to in phase and quadrature, and then you add them all up. So you take the 5 quadrature signals and you get a net quadrature signal, and then a 5 in phase signal and you get a net in phase signal. And this might be something you would do for a section of LINAC to tell you sort of on the bulk what the machine is doing if you wanted to do a parameter, a dimensionality reduction. So you're sort of saying, okay, well, this is a simplified representation of all 5 tanks. When we do that and we look at the fractional change in these parameters, so we're subtracted out the median and we're normalizing to the median. So these are small changes, sub 2%, close to 1% or so for the initial to final value. There's definitely some changes in the sum signals, like in the in phase and quadrature signals, but it's not. First of all, the order of the scale is a bit lower than the scale of the current changes, and it's, if you were to say, oh, is the RF in a significantly different state at the end of the 20-week study period versus the beginning, it's difficult to say from looking at this that it is, just because we're talking about percent or so level changes, which those aren't huge for the RF system. And then for another thing we looked at was just a simple singular value decomposition. And here the idea is you look at just chunks of data across the 20-week period and you compute the singular values, and then you aggregate over the singular values to get a net parameter. If you want to know how we do the aggregation for this, we can talk about that later, but basically this singular value decomposition doesn't show, again, it shows some shift in the RF state, but it's hard to say, oh, there's this very clear change that's correlated with the change in the beam current that we can see on the left. So next we want to look at autoencoders and see if we can learn something more about what the machine is doing by analyzing the latent space. So we studied autoencoders for a few different architectures. So this is usually what I do is just start simple, pick the minimum number of encoded dimensions or latent space dimensions as I can, and then I just increase it until the training and validation loss are no longer getting better. This schematic on the left is the architecture for the autoencoder, and then on the right, we're looking at the loss as a function of training epoch for a few different test cases. And here I'm averaging over initialization, random initialization. So there's 10 random initializations for each case study, and we just do an average to get an idea of which architecture is going to be the best one. There's obviously a very big change in the final validation and training loss for looking at one encoded node versus looking at two encoded nodes. And the change from 2 to 3 encoded nodes is not quite as significant. So there's some value in having a simpler latent space if you're thinking about it in terms of what's the easiest thing for an operator to look at. And I think, and then also just there's a, you can look at the latent space and say, oh, did having a third latent space dimension or third encoded dimension tell us anything more than just having two? And in this case, it wasn't a significant increase in performance. So we just went with the 2 encoded nodes or 2 latent space dimensions for the rest of the analysis. So we trained the autoencoder on the data and then said, okay, let's look at the latent space output for 2 different test cases. When I say test cases, I'm saying there's 2 different initializations of random weights. So these top and bottom outputs are looking at latent space dimensions as a function of time throughout the study period. And then the difference between top and bottom is that there's just 2 different random initializations. This gives you an idea of how much of an effect the random initializations have on the raw output of the latent space. But qualitatively, the output of the latent spaces are similar. There's relatively stable operations between the weeks 5 and weeks 13 or so, and then things start changing. And these changes are, relatively well correlated with changes in the beam current. And there, I'll show on the next slide how this compares to the traditional analysis techniques. So here you're looking at, I have on the bottom left is the INQ decomposition that I showed earlier, and then the SVD metric alongside the latent space output. What's of particular interest, I think, is that if you look at just the INQ metric, you do see this change in the INQ components right around between weeks 12 and 14, and then in the same in the latent space analysis, we see the same change, but it's magnified. It's much larger. So that's saying that either the change in the RF that's shown in the INQ decomposition is just more significant in the latent space, or something. There's something different about it, right? It's not. You're getting a larger signal, and it's saying that there's something that's significantly different about what's going on here versus what was happening at the beginning of the study. And then the other thing is that at the end of the study period, there's a significant offset in the latent space compared to the beginning, especially in the top one. The orange dimension is settled out to a much different value than it started at. And if you look at the Q component of the IQ decomposition, it's changed by maybe 1% or so. Whereas here the fractional change was 1, so it's 100% change. It's a big change as opposed to a pretty small change. So this is suggestive that there's more going on in the RF than is necessarily easily digestible by these sort of simplified metrics, and I think motivates the use of autoencoders for doing dimensionality reduction, for latent space analysis, as part of like a diagnostic tool. So next I want to move on to the second study, which is detecting magnet power supply faults in the APS storage ring. So here we're trying to answer 2 questions. The first question is, can we predict if a fault will occur? And the second question is, if we can predict that a fault will occur, which magnet is going to fault? the storage ring, just for familiarization, is broken down into 40 sectors. Each sector has an A section and a B section, and I've highlighted those here in green and blue respectively. And then in each section, there are quadrupoles, sextupoles, and corrector magnets. There's also the dipoles. We're not studying the dipoles in this particular analysis, but we could do that in the future. Right now, we're just interested in studying the dipoles, the quadrupoles, the correctors, and the sextupoles. And all told, there's 1,320 magnet power supplies in the ring, and that's a pretty significant increase in the number of parameters as opposed to the previous study. For each magnet, we have time series data, and the time series data, there's a lot of reference data. So this is data that's taken during normal operations where there's no faults that occur. And then we have a number of test data where a fault does occur at some point in the future, and the fault's not included in the data set. So there's some magnet that fails. We know which magnet, in many cases, we know which magnet fails, but we don't have the actual minutes leading up to the failure inside the data set. So we just are looking for precursors. This is all about predictive fault detection. So this is sort of motivated by can you minimize unplanned maintenance? Because these magnets do fail, and then if they fail during a run, then you have to fix it, as opposed to, can you say a week in advance is it going to fail, and then replace it during planned maintenance. For each magnet, we have power supply temperatures, we have magnet current, and we have the magnet temperature. And then on the right, I'm just showing an example of a couple of different data sets. 1,300 parameters is not insurmountable for machine learning. It's certainly a reasonable number. We just wanted to simplify the problem a bit first to get an idea of how well things perform in a simpler system. Also, if it works really well, there's some value in being able to identify which sector the magnet is going to be in that fails. It reduces the search problem down significantly. So we looked at aggregating over the sector or aggregating over the type of magnet in the sector. So you can say, oh, well, it's a quadrupole in sector 10A that's going to fail. And these are just ways of simplifying the problem down a little bit, just to make it a little bit easier to get started with it. So when we aggregate by sector, this is just an overview of the data set. These plots are a little bit challenging, I think, to just look at without any context, or even with some context, it's sort of hard to know what really is going on here. What I'm looking for is trying to understand how different the test data is from the training data set. So for the autoencoders, we want to train on known good data and then test on unknown data. And the question is, how far away is the unknown data from the known data? So on the far left, I'm showing the training data and the test data, the training and validation data looks the same. And then you're basically saying from the vertical axis is the input parameter and the horizontal axis is the scale dimension. So I'm showing it after scaling. We can look at it before scaling, but because I'm aggregating over the sector, it's sort of the unscaled value kind of loses its meaning. And now we're just saying, okay, this is a parameter that's associated with a sector, and we have time series data. In the middle, I'm looking at the test data. So these are all known to be anomalies. This particular test set, every single one of the magnets in the test, every single test sets had a magnet that failed. And then the far right is just looking at the difference between the two. So how similar are these? And there are definitely some visual differences. There are some visual similarities. For example, they both have this sort of X pattern in the bottom here. And they both have these sort of same vertical clusterings. But they are obviously, if you look at the difference between the two, there are some significant differences. So there should be able to learn something by training on just the reference data and then testing on the test data. So we're training an autoencoder on the reference data, and this is just an example of visualizing how well the autoencoder reproduces the reference data. The R-squared value is basically for the predicted validation data versus the ground truth validation data. And then on the right, I'm just showing predicted validation data versus ground truth validation data. There's a few different sectors on each plot, and this is just to show that, hey, they're all straight lines, which is what you'd expect if the autoencoder is trained well and is performing a good reconstruction on the training data. And that's what, and the R-squared value tells us the exact same thing. So the just looking at like raw output, this is the reconstruction error for a number of different sectors. So the top is sector by sector. Each color is a different sector, and this is just what's the reconstruction error for a given parameter, and just as a function of sample numbers. It's all flattened. There's a fair amount of data in here. And then if you want to look at a single parameter, you can just calculate the RMS reconstruction error. So this would then further aggregate over all the sectors to say how well is this particular data point being reconstructed. And that's what the bottom plot is showing, the RMS reconstruction error as a function of time, or as a function of sample number. And this is used to, you can use this to set a threshold. So if you say, oh, the threshold for reconstruction is 0.6, then none of our reference data is going to be flagged as faulty. And I can then use this going forward to say how much of how well am I finding anomalies if I set this as my threshold. So then we test the autoencoder on the fault data. The fault data, again, it's not, none of this data is seen in training or in validation. The architecture is not tuned up on the fault data or anything like that. It's purely tests. And again, the time when the magnet failed is not in the test data set. So this is purely predictive tests. The top is looking at the reconstruction error for, just again, as a function of sample number by sector. So you can see in some cases there's many sectors that are failing the reconstruction test, and then in some cases there's nothing that's failing the reconstruction test. All told, if you set the threshold to 0.6, about 8% of the data is flagged as faulty. If you're looking at run by runs, and some of the runs are longer than others, and I'll show that in the next slide, it correctly identifies 16 out of 26 of the test runs as anomalous. And then the bottom is the RMS reconstruction error. So that's the aggregate parameter if you want to look at just one value. And then this is a ROC curve, which just as we vary that threshold, we can increase that true positive rate up to 100%, but we do get some false positives where we incorrectly identify reference data as being anomalous. But the false positive rate is still very, very small. I mean, this is fractions of a percent false positive rate just to get up to 100% true positive rate. So that works pretty well. This is looking at setting the threshold to 0.6. So this was trying to say, okay, well, we've identified that a magnet's going to fault, but can we identify which sector the magnet's in? And so this is looking at which sectors are flagging as being faulty. Because we set the threshold at 0.6, a number of the sectors are not flagged as faulty. That's we don't get 100% true positive identification. But in the cases where we do get true positive identification, there's a number of cases where we flag many sectors as being faulty as opposed to just one or two or three in some cases. So it sort of makes it difficult to say, well, using this specific technique, identifying which sector is going to fail is going to be very challenging. But there's other things that we can do. I mean, you don't need to look at RMS reconstruction error. You can look at a few different things, and there's work to be done in this area, but it's certainly sort of heading in the right direction. And then the other question is, what does it look like in time domain? So how far in advance of the fault do we see this failure of the reconstruction test? And in many cases, you see it the whole time. So for all of the test data, once we start testing it, it's failing the reconstruction test, which means that there's indicators, hours before the fault occurs that a fault is going to occur, and that those indicators are detected by the autoencoder. And we don't have the longest prediction window that we have is about an hour and a half, a little more. So we can't say anything more than that. We just need some more data in order to be able to look at it further in the future, or look further in the future. But so far it's suggestive that we should be able to detect these faults fairly well in advance, and potentially warn experimentalists that the beam may trip in some amount of time and that they should wrap up their experiments or be prepared for that to happen. So just sort of wrapping up, in the framework, we talked about two different methods for applying autoencoders to anomaly detection for operations. In the Fermilab LINAC, we did this sort of root cause analysis using the latent space to try to understand whether or not the RF is changing as much as we think it is, and compared that to more traditional metrics for analyzing RF data. And then we looked at autoencoders for reconstructing magnet data in the APS storage ring to try to do predictive fault detection in the ring. I want to take a second to thank institutional support for this work. Michael Worland, the APS, supplied us with the magnet data and gave us the motivation for working on that particular project, and that's been super helpful. And also thanks to Fermilab for ongoing support and helping us with getting log data over the study period. So next I'm going to shift to the practical example, and this is the notebook that it's going to be shared with everybody. And this example is using autoencoders for detecting credit card fraud. I'm not going to talk too much about the imports. I mean, standard imports, we're using things like NumPy, Matplotlib. I do want to talk a little bit about scalars. Right now, for this particular data set, I'm using the robust scaler. I've used a few different scalars. The scaler that you use to prescale your data is sort of problem dependent. Sometimes it makes sense to use a min-max scaler, sometimes it makes sense to use a robust scaler or different types of scalars. It just kind of depends on what kind of distribution your data has. If your data is fairly uniformly distributed, then standard scalars, min-max scalars work really well. Robust scaler is a little bit better for these sort of non-uniform distributions. And I think that it works well for a lot of the applications that I've used it on. But it does affect which activation functions which scaler you use can affect which activation functions you want to use. These are just some helper functions for plotting. I'm not going to go into details here. In the notebook, we provide some descriptions about autoencoders, links to some blog entries, the schematic from the talk, just to help sort of visualize things. And then the data set for this credit card fraud detection is from Kaggle competition. So the data set's available. It's easy to get and import. This cell is just extracting the labels and splitting it up because there's the data set does have labels in it, but for using autoencoders, we want to separate the data that is labeled as fraudulent from the data that's labeled as non-fraudulent, because we don't want to train on any data that's labeled as fraudulent. The idea is that you don't know whether or not you're going to have a fraudulent credit card transaction, or you don't know what fraudulent looks like necessarily, but you do know what normal looks like, so you can train on that. I did include this is just a histogram plot for visualizing the data set. There's lots of different approaches to visualizing the data sets. The plot that I showed in the talk is this sort of waterfall, sort of 2D histogram thing. Sometimes if there's not that many parameters, it makes sense to just plot the histograms on top of each other, looking at both training and validation together, because you want to know whether your distributions are sampled sort of evenly, or whether you are undersampling the validation set in some region or undersampling the training data set in some region, because that'll affect how well your model is generalizing. For this case, I just picked ReLUs. ReLUs worked well with the robust scaler, and then Gaussian noise. The autoencoder, you have to play around with hyperparameters. So generally start with more sort of layers and more nodes than you probably need, and then see if you're overfitting. And if you're not overfitting, you can add more. And if you are overfitting, then you can decrease the complexity. But there's just hyperparameter tuning. You can use a grid search. There's a lot of different things you can do to optimize the architecture. But it's definitely one of the it can be a labor-intensive process to finding the right network structure. And then just using the Keras API, build a network loss function for a lot of stuff. I just use mean squared error. There's arguments for custom loss functions or other loss functions, depending on if it just sort of starts working out of the box, then you probably don't need anything more complicated than that. But if you do have sort of weird data sets or you have weird features, then you may want to consider a custom loss function, and those aren't, there's some work to implement that. And this is going to train, I have this model saved, so I'm going to train it for 10 epochs, but it's pretty slow, just there's a fair amount of data, and I'm not on a GPU right now, so it'll take a minute or so. But this plot function, that's the helper function that's initialized earlier in the notebook, and basically allows you to visualize as it's training that the loss is going down, both the training loss and the validation loss. And if you were to train this for 1,000 epochs, then you would get to a pretty low level, and then at that point you could save the model. And I like to look at both the linear scale and the log scale. I think it's helpful for visualization. And I already have the saved model. You can load the model back in and use that, and you can say, oh, well, what was in the model? This tells you all the different parameters that are in the model that we saved. It's the same model. It's just I let it train longer because it takes a while. For visualizing the results, I like to look at the predicted output against the ground truth, just because if, like I showed, and you could just look at the R-squared if you want to look at a more consolidated view. I think it's easy to just look at that real quick and say, hey, this is a parameter that's clearly not training very well, or these parameters clearly are training well. I'm plotting the predictions both for the very quickly trained model versus the one that was loaded. You can see that the orange obviously performs a lot better. So just training longer, it starts to fit better. So this is the PDF view or density function view of the error on the training data, or the validation data in this case, but it's from the data set that was used for training. And this gives you an idea of like what the max threshold would be that you would need to say, if we want to flag something as anomalous, what's the largest value we need to flag to get all of the training, all of the reference data to be not anomalous. And in this case, it's like 55 or so. And then we can look at the test data and just get a visual that the test data set is a bit different from the training data set, which is good to see, because if you're going to be able to flag these as anomalous, it can't be too similar, of course. And then you can make the ROC curve, which basically varies the threshold and then plots the true positive rate against the false positive rate. So obviously, you don't want to have a lot of false positives. You want to have a lot of true positives. So you'd want to probably set the threshold somewhere in here where you'd miss some, but you'd get a lot of it. And this is sort of like a semi-supervised thing. Obviously, if you're setting the threshold based on how well the autoencoder sort of works on test data that you understand, or like test data where you say I have known faults or known anomalies, then it's no longer totally unsupervised. Now it's sort of semi-supervised. Totally unsupervised approach would be to say, set the threshold to 50, and how many, what percentage of the data is flagged as anomalous versus not anomalous. So you'd say all of the reference data is sort of good, and you tell me whether or not the test data is good or bad. Okay, that concludes the webinar. I guess I'm going to stop sharing now and open it up.
Thank you very much, John. That was excellent. If you have any questions at this point, would you please type them into the Q&A section on the bottom of your Zoom interface? Just as a follow-up, I'll be showing John's contact information here on the screen. So you're welcome to contact him directly if you have any questions. We will be sending out a link via email to each of you so that you can access the webinar again and see a recording of it. We also will be sending in that email the Jupyter notebook for each of you. Again, thank you very much for your time. There's a question actually, John, is there a good guideline for how to pick the dimensionality of your latent space?
Yeah, it's a great question. Short answer is no, I don't have one. My rule of thumb is to start with one, or start with the smallest number you think is reasonable and then increase it from there until it starts learning. That can be time consuming, obviously. If you have a large dimensional space, maybe you start with 10 and then maybe 100 input parameters, reduce it by a factor of 10, reduce it by a factor of 2. I guess the thing to remember is that if your latent space is the same dimensionality as your input data, then your network could just say, oh, well, input equals output is just a 1, and then it's not learning any kind of reduced representation.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, well, here are a couple. This may be slightly outside of scope, but do you think that someday usage of machine learning encoders could lead to relaxed requirements for instrumentation?
It's a really good question. That'd be very interesting to study. You could probably study that in simulation and get an idea of whether or not you could do that. I don't know. But I think that's certainly an interesting line of inquiry for sure.
Great. Here's another one. What hyperparameter tuning program do you recommend?
Honestly, I haven't used a hyperparameter tuning program like any of these automated things. I've used grid searches, and I don't have a good answer to that, unfortunately. I know there's a lot of resources out there for hyperparameter tuning, but yeah. Okay.
And another one here, is there any other application of autoencoders in accelerator physics other than fault detection?
Yeah, I'm sure that there are. I mean, I think you could consider, I think there's a lot of things you could consider. I'd have to give it some thought, but I'm sure that fault detection is not the only mechanism for using autoencoders in accelerator physics.
Okay. Any other questions?
I see a question in the chat. So the question is, I suspect that RF alone is not sufficient for LINAC detection. Why exclude other data? It's a good question. So I think the purpose of the study was try to understand if there's more information in the RF data than is being sort of immediately identified by just like sort of straightforward analysis techniques. If you can do this in a supervised way. You can say, oh, tell me if I can learn to predict the beam current from the RF parameters, and this does work. So there's obviously some relationship between the beam current and the RF parameters that can be learned by a neural net. But the idea here is, like, in a totally unsupervised fashion, you don't want to use the toroid data in the training. You want to just look at the RF data.
Okay. That's all of our questions, John. So let me finish by thanking you for your excellent presentation, and thanks for everyone else who joined us today. Keep your eyes out. We try to do our webinars on roughly a monthly basis, and we look forward to seeing you again on a future webinar.